Star Wars is too big, but it's also too small. Like, the budgets are through the roof, tons of people are working on separate content, with Disney trying to appeal to as wide a demographic as they can, but I just don't know if that's possible given where the franchise has gone at this point. The idea that the Star Wars galaxy feels too small is nothing new. It was a common jab at the prequel trilogy, with things like Anakin building C-3PO and Chewbacca being pals with Yoda feeling super contrived, especially since those characters never share a word in the original movies. That stuff is certainly dumb, but reveals like that aren't deal breakers. You can just kinda watch them, roll your eyes, and then move on to the next scene. What might have had more of an impact is that the prequels also went out of their way to centralize the fate of the galaxy on just a handful of characters. Now, in the original trilogy, we didn't really see any conflict beyond the Skywalkers, but the world building was pretty vague at the time, so we could plausibly imagine other major events. In the prequels, though, the Chosen One prophecy and the Sith Rule of Two explicitly told us that this small handful of characters were at the center of the universe. For the prequel trilogy itself, this isn't a massive problem. It might make suspension of disbelief a little harder, but it also raises the stakes. Like, now this unstable, sand-hating brat is the galaxy's capital S savior, and we just have to deal with that. When it came to the larger Star Wars universe, though, these world-building choices established a level of centrality that the franchise has since had a pretty difficult time moving away from. That said, there were some ways around it at first. After the prequels, but before the Disney buyout, there were plenty of new Star Wars stories, with the Clone Wars TV show and plenty of expanded universe, books, comics, and games. These were constrained by the canon to some extent, but they had two benefits that later spin-offs and sequels wouldn't have. First, they can actually use the core Star Wars characters as much as they wanted. Second, their dubiously canon status meant that they could take some liberties with the world-building conundrums of the prequels. Even the Clone Wars, which was easily the most mainstream new Star Wars thing in this period, really loopholed the Rule of Two by introducing several new darkside users who weren't technically Sith. The Star Wars fandom was smaller then than it is today, but I'd say it was in a pretty healthy place, as the galaxy expanded in multiple directions and started to take down those unnecessary barriers. All in all, it seemed like the Star Wars universe had a lot of untapped potential, without everything needing to tie directly back to 3 movies about a few plucky rebels fighting a faceless empire and 2 big bad guys. And then, you know what happened. Disney bought Star Wars and made a new trilogy, and amidst the hellfire of discourse surrounding these movies, I think one thing most of us can agree on is that the world building is pretty lazy. The core conflict is Empire versus Rebels again, just renamed. I hesitate to even call it reskinned, because giving Stormtroopers a Joker smile does not a new skin make. Once again, the Jedi are cast into legend, their former leader has chosen exile, a guy in a black mask turned on them for being lawful stupid, a kid from a desert planet needs to carry on the Jedi's legacy, somehow Palpatine returned, Glup Shido gets a cameo, it's the same shit we've seen before. Some people act like The Last Jedi was this radical shakeup of the universe, but it really wasn't. It might have teased being that, with Luke wanting the Jedi to end and Kylo suggesting he and Rey forge their own path, but by the end of the movie, Luke turns around completely, confidently announcing that he isn't the last Jedi, while Kylo returns to screaming bloody murder. Then Rise of Skywalker came around and told us everything bad secretly came from the villain from the old movies, and our final line of dialogue tells us Rey is a Skywalker. This is the climax of a 9-movie, 40-year series, and it exists to throw away whatever distinctiveness the sequel trilogy had by stretching all credibility to tell us that Star Wars is still about the Skywalkers versus the Emperor. God, this movie sucks. You know what else sucks? The world building, which might be the single worst part of the sequel trilogy, is also the part with the largest impact on the rest of the series going forward. Every single one of the Disney Plus shows so far is technically a prequel, and the future of the canon will always hang over those shows' heads. Shows like Ahsoka and The Mandalorian do add some new ideas to the universe, or at least bring them to a mainstream audience, but I can't shake the feeling that these new additions don't actually carry much weight, partially because of their status as prequels. It's hard to care about new political factions if you know they'll be pretty much irrelevant come the arrival of the First Order. It's harder to care about Ahsoka learning from past mistakes when training new Jedi if you know the Jedi Order will once again become a reclusive cult who creates their own worst enemy. These problems are made even worse by the fact that most of the major classic characters can't easily show up on screen due to their actors getting up there in age, losing interest in the franchise, or in some cases no longer being alive. So what we have is a lineup of shows that worship the established narrative with cameos and references, but have almost no opportunity to expand on it directly. The ever-increasing lineup of new characters can only be retconned into the larger story, and we're only left to guess why they never show up in the future trilogy. And do you even want to imagine any interactions between Grogu and TLJ-era Luke? Because I sure don't. But Star Wars doesn't have to tie everything together, right? Can't you just have a good standalone show that doesn't tie into the grander light side versus dark side or Rebels versus Empire conflict of the series? There are still plenty of new corners of the galaxy to explore, aren't there? Well, given the trajectory of the world building and the stories Lucasfilm has decided to tell, it honestly doesn't feel like there are. At this point, it's worth comparing Star Wars to other massive fictional universes with sprawling canon. Marvel, DC, Pokemon, Warhammer, Magic the Gathering, Star Trek, The Elder Scrolls, various D&D settings, and so on. Like Star Wars, all of these revolve around larger-than-life heroes and conflicts, but unlike Star Wars, they all have a pretty huge variety of independent threats and plot hooks. Sure, there's some iconography that carries over between installments, but all of those properties are full of distinct locations, conflicts, and villains whose stories can feel totally distinct and never have to tie directly to the others. The Borg are nothing like the Klingons. Dagoth is nothing like Alduin. Thanos is nothing like the Kingpin. Most of those settings also have a large diversity of powers and magic systems that allow characters from various places to stand out, even in things like the action scenes. Star Wars isn't like that. Every single show and movie has focused on either the Empire or the Force, often both. If it's comparable to any other large franchise, it's Lord of the Rings, where the entire setting is delineated into two clear factions of good versus evil, and magic is limited to a small number of major players on each side. But Star Wars is trying to support a much larger array of spin-offs than we've ever seen in Middle-earth, and it's not doing very much to move beyond that very centralized good versus evil paradigm. Even The Mandalorian, which is nominally a space western about bounty hunters rather than rebels or Jedi, has a Force user as a deuteragonist and an Imperial revivalist as a main villain. It's just very difficult to ignore the Empire and the Force when the former spans the entire galaxy and the latter binds the galaxy together. But is it possible to move outside that scope? On a most literal level, what happens if you leave the galaxy? Can you move fully beyond that Rebel Jedi versus Sith Empire paradigm then? Well, in Ahsoka, we do get to see outside the galaxy. And when I learned that's where the story was headed, I was pretty excited. What kind of radical new landscapes would we see there? What kind of bizarre new aliens? How would the Force work, if it would exist at all? Well, it turned out this extragalactic planet was mostly just barren hills and crab people. There was a bit of a King Arthur aesthetic, which shined through in a handful of scenes, but overall, it felt nearly identical to the galaxy we already knew. And once again, we've got an Imperial military dude threatening galactic freedom with a giant gray spacecraft, forging an uneasy alliance with Dark Force users, all while a young hero searches for a lost rebel leader, trains in the Force with an old master, and gets tempted by the dark side. It doesn't take a genius to see the similarities to the original Star Wars movie, from 1977. 46 years later, we're still sticking to that formula. And even visual elements like stormtroopers, star destroyers, and force powers have hardly changed either. Again, Ahsoka could have really shaken things up, particularly with the Night Sisters. I mean, you're adding witches to live-action Star Wars. It was intriguing to hear they'd be in the show, and they have a few cool moments in the last episode, but it's mostly too little too late. Combine that with the statue of the Mortis trio at the end, and it seems like Disney only wants to acknowledge the genuinely esoteric parts of the Star Wars mythos in fits and starts. Now, some might say the Night Sisters and the like should be used sparingly to avoid being demystified, and I agree to a point. I certainly don't want to see another midi-chlorian situation. But still, there's a way to keep things mysterious while also not making them feel like an afterthought. Speaking of those statues, I think the Mortis arc in the Clone Wars was a prime example of how to do it right. In that arc, we had 3 entire episodes set in a world outside known space that looks nothing like what we've seen in Star Wars, where physics and the Force seem to work differently, inhabited only by 3 godlike beings on the verge of all-out clash. And yet, we never truly learn where those beings came from, what their powers are, or how they fit into established prophecies. The Mortis arc brought a level of mystique back to the Force that I hadn't seen since first getting into Star Wars, and it made the universe feel much bigger and less explored. And you know what? I don't even think this arc was a masterpiece. The plot had some issues. But daring to go so out there in terms of setting was more than enough to make those episodes memorable. And I'd say there's far more to explore with the Mortis gods alone before they even begin to lose their luster. But Disney is content to show some statues of the gods for 8 seconds and nothing else, cause of course they gotta make room for yet another Jedi versus Stormtroopers showdown. So how long can Disney keep doing this? I'm really not sure. Streaming numbers are impossible to tell for certain, but various sources claim they are going down for these new shows. And anecdotally, not a lot of people in my circle are talking about Ahsoka, Mando Season 3, or even that one good show they made. If they don't seriously change their approach, more and more people are going to skip these things going forward. So how can Star Wars change its approach? Some people might think the answer is to learn from Andor. Like, that show is great, and it manages to explore a new side of the universe while also strengthening the existing canon. I agree with all of those things, and there are a ton of lessons to be learned from Andor's writing and direction, but at the same time, not every Star Wars project should look like Andor. For one thing, the total absence of lightsabers and Jedi and the Force was a big part of Andor's identity, and while it was refreshing in that show, those things shouldn't go away entirely. For another, as different as it feels from most Star Wars media, Andor is still a direct prequel to the original film. I'm sure there are some other legacy characters who could get that treatment, but with such a crowded canon, aging legacy actors, and all the inherent problems with prequels, it's probably better to focus more on 100% original characters and time periods going forward. Some upcoming Star Wars projects look like they might be doing this. The show The Acolyte is supposed to be set 100 years before The Phantom Menace, and James Mangold's film is supposed to be set thousands of years before The Phantom Menace. I'm cautiously optimistic about both, since neither will be able to use fan service at all, and they're both looking to explore new settings and influences. Still, I think the best solution is to look toward the future, and get Star Wars out of the prequel rut it's currently in. As for that, well, we are still apparently getting a movie about Rey training a new Jedi Order in the next couple of years. I am less excited about that because Rey has the personality of a toaster and we'd probably be better off pretending Rise of Skywalker never happened, but I'll at least give it the benefit of the doubt. Hopefully it won't be so embarrassing as to dissuade Lucasfilm from ever trying to go beyond the sequel trilogy again. Another thing to consider is that Star Wars is also fairly unique among massive franchises in that it's never moved beyond a single continuity, at least in on-screen form, and that could be worth trying. We wouldn't need to start over entirely, just imagine a one-off Elseworlds scenario like Joker or the Batman. Talented creators could have free reign to reimagine some aspect of the Star Wars mythos. Particularly someone whose character is interesting in concept, but just wasn't handled that well in the canon, like Finn or Qui-Gon. Or they could adapt old EU stories with a new cast. That could open up so many possibilities, right? Yeah, no way. This is fucking Disney we're talking about. Once those reboot floodgates are opened, they can make the fan service even more shameless and creatively bankrupt. Just look at what they're already doing to their animated classics. Yeah, just forget I said that last part. The Skywalker era is dead and it should stay dead. Beyond that, we can only hope.